MALSPAM measures. So basically, we're going to take a look at a lot of the big email campaigns that have hit a lot of us over the past year, and really look at each step of the kill chain of that attack and figure out what are some of the free mitigations we can deploy as opposed to just relying on blinky boxes. Also, I want to thank everyone for being here because I realize I'm the last thing yet again standing between you and all the free booze that they're providing tonight. So introduction to myself, for those who don't know me, I'm the Director of SecOps for Activision Blizzard. For us, that means threat intel, incident response, pen testing, and all that fun stuff. I'm a big fan of the whole purple team concept, and that's kind of what we have been doing to where, you know, we're all in one team. We are doing pen testing. We're seeing what the detections look like and building detections around it. Been pretty successful. A couple shameless plugs about where you can find me. You know, Twitter, Medium, my blog that I really haven't updated in a long time, but there's a couple things on there in case you're interested. Obligatory disclaimer, everything here is just my thoughts and not my employer. So again, the objectives is we're going to take a look at the kill chain. If you're not familiar, it's a concept by Lockheed Martin to where you break down every attack kind of in the logical steps that make it up. But as opposed to using the kill chain verbatim, we're going to kind of make it simplify the steps. We're going to focus on mitigations at each step of it, as well as try to find things that are free or as close to free as possible. Not going to be relying on any traditional signatures such as antivirus or just spam protection, things like that. Also, I don't want to give everyone the wrong idea. This isn't going to stop, you know, China and Russia APT cybers. Like, this is just supposed to help boost your security posture. The biggest focus I'm going to have is malicious Word documents. Since that's kind of been a real popular theme over the past couple of years, especially it's kind of come back again pretty recently. So one thing, one additional concept, and not designed to stop APT attacks that I preach is I kind of picture the SecOps job as finding the needle in the haystack. So every mitigation that we can deploy basically helps to reduce the size of that haystack. So if we apply all these mitigations and stop as much of the MALSPAM and phishing as much as possible, it should make it easier to find the needle. So I'm going to break the general phishing attack down into these basic steps. There's the pre-email, which is what they do before they actually get the email to you. The actual phish and MALSPAM email itself, the malware they try to deliver, and then the command and control of that malware. There's general email anti-spam tips. I'm not going to go into detail on any of these. I'm just going to assume you know what they are or already have them in place, but just wanted to call out because they are still important to have. You know, reverse DNS lookups, the footer appending, SPF, DKIM, sandboxing, all that good stuff. So, one common theme with phishing attacks is, as well as watering hole attacks, would be domain typo squatting. So, for example, if you look at Derbycon.com, if they wanted to phish people who had email at Derbycon.com, they may register emails like Derbycon1.com, Debbicon, Derby-con.com. They can either use these to then send emails from it to try to trick employees into thinking it's a legit company email. Or they could also host malicious websites on here as well, which again to trick end users into believing it's a legit company site. So what are some things we can do about these? So there are services like Monitor and RiskIQ that can monitor these for you and give you alerts. But that is a service, and again, the focus of this talk is on free stuff. So there's a project out there called Python DNS Twist. It's out on GitHub. It's pretty cool. All you do is feed it a domain name, and it does every substitution within its library, and then looks up what domains are registered. So as one example, if you look at, if you feed it Derbycon, it'll actually go through every iteration possible, look to see if it's registered and see what the records are. You can even pass it more parameters to do full whois lookups on it, tell you what the A records are, MX records, as well as you can do GeoIP lookup. So once you've identified these domains, you can proactively block them at your firewall. One thing that I recommend is to create a custom URL category group in whatever your web filtering solution is, and basically, make it fake company domains, what have you. And you can toss all these domain names into there, and then in your alert system, you can actually, if you put them in the custom category, you can then alert on things that are in that category and better track campaigns that are hitting you. Additionally, on your spam filter side, you could proactively configure your spam filter to block any emails coming from those domains before they've even sent you one, which is pretty cool. Or depending on the size of your team, you can also, depending on also on the spam solution, you could actually create rules that actually send emails from these domains to a quarantine, so that way no email is lost or blocked. But on top of that, it didn't go to the end user, but the security team still has access to go and retrieve them and do analysis. It might be like an early warning indicator of when someone's about to target you, or an oncoming campaign. Another thing I would definitely recommend is when you find domains like this that are registered, especially if you find evidence that there's something malicious, whether it's a scam or they're trying to attack you. Also look at passive DNS information, such as OpenDNS or passive total, to pivot. So what you'll see a lot of times is they'll register a domain that they're going to use to scam you with. You look up the whois information, see who registered it, and then you can pivot from that and see every other domain they registered, and oftentimes proactively find other active scams that they may have running at that time.
The MACRO-ADFS choice, can that be automated, or is that a manual process?
No, it can be automated. Yep. It even has an option to do JSON output, so you could actually feed that to another tool to automatically handle it and route it as you need. So back to our kill chain. I'm going to keep referencing this as we go. So basically, on the pre-email side, that step we've applied a couple steps to help mitigate and stop that. So now we're going to look at the actual phish and MALSPAM itself. So super easy one that, we all know it's best practice, but it's still often overlooked, is to really just review the attachments that your spam filter allows. A lot of spam filters by default will block some of these, but not all of them, so it's always good to do a full review. At the bottom, there's actually a How To Geek article that lists the top 50 extensions that can be potentially dangerous. So you could review those and add them to your spam filter as needed. The ones I highlighted in red are some of the more popular attachments we've seen over the past couple years. CHMs, JavaScript files, DOCM, PPTM. But also be aware that before 2007, the Office documents could still have a macro embedded in them, but with the .doc extension. So one thing you can do with some spam filtering solutions actually have the ability to fingerprint that it has a macro in it, regardless of what the extension is. So if your solution has that, you can turn that on. It's super beneficial. Another great thing you can do is there are several Outlook add-ins available that are free that make it easier for your user to go in and report it to you. One is there's Phish Alert by KnowBe4. There's the Phish Reporter itself, which is, I think it's on GitHub. PhishMe has a solution as well. I'm not too knowledgeable on it. But kind of the concept here is for anyone who's had an end user report a phishing email to them, oftentimes they'll just forward it to you, but you kind of lose the headers, and then you have to go through the rigmarole of giving them directions on how to get it to you. So a lot of these add-ins, what they'll do is say the phishing email appears in the end user's mailbox. They can click the button. It deletes the email from their inbox, but also sends it to an email of your configuration as an attachment with all the header information intact. So not only have you made it easier for them to delete it, you've made it easier for them to report it to you meaningfully with the information you need, so it's more actionable. So after the email itself, I'm sure this is an example that pretty much everyone has seen, to where they'll, have some meaningful message along with a malicious Word document that has a macro in it. The idea to get the user to download the document and run the macro, and it'll do evil. So earlier we looked at the kill chain of just the email itself, but what we can do even beyond that is just take the Word document itself and break it down and do a kill chain. So there's a couple different tactics that we've all observed over the past couple years. So after you open the Word document, it's either going to have an embedded exploit in it or a macro. There's actually a FIREWALLING link at the bottom from an attack in April that was using an exploit that was interesting. After the exploit or macro is run, it'll either download a binary or download and run a JavaScript file, download and run an HTA file. And then may even download additional files on top of that. Then the command and control starts, and then that's when bad stuff happens. So for the next couple, or the next two detections, there's one interesting thing about Windows that is important to understand and how we're going to deploy them, and that whenever a file is downloaded from the internet on a Windows machine, it actually uses an alternative data stream to tag an attribute of it that, hey, this came from the zone internet. So I'm not going to go into details about the file streams and that, but I do have some reference link up here that go into more detail. The real important thing to know is that Windows is actually tagging files that come from the internet, not from the internal network, with a zone identifier, and that's how the next couple things are going to work. So Office Protected View, it's actually enabled by default, I believe, since 2010. But the user can disable it, and oftentimes they will. So you can actually deploy a group policy to enforce it. So the reason Office Protected View is important is it's got several validation steps that it'll add, as well as it'll actually help mitigate some of the attacks. Like if you look at the FireEye link from April, Protected View actually mitigates some of the exploits that have been observed. So if you look at group policy itself, once you've imported the Office group policy extensions, it's pretty easy to find. There's actually just a setting for turn off Protected View for attachments open from Outlook. And you can force that to no, so then your end users can't change it at all. And what it results in is whenever they open an untrusted document, you get the Protected View ribbon that tells you that hey, it contains all this, and then they have to enable editing to open it. What's also interesting is if you're talking about macros, before we get to that mitigation, is if they open a malicious Word document with macros, the end user would have to hit enable editing for Protected View to then get the pop-up to enable macros. So you're actually basically giving them one more chance to get the answer wrong. So on top of that, we can look at ways to handle the macros itself. So there's actually a group policy that uses the same ADFS tagging to block macro execution if the file comes from the internet. This was, I think, first added in Office 2016, and I think it's been backported back to 2013. But again, once you've imported the management templates, there's an option to block macros from running in Office files from the internet. And what that does is if a file comes from the internet, instead of getting the typical, hey, you got to enable macros, the user will actually just get a warning that says this is blocked content. It's been completely disabled, and you have to talk to your administrator to change it. So going back to the kill chain, if we look at Protected View and blocking the macros, we've basically taken care of the first chain. Now we'll go to the next one. So most of the macros that I've seen in Office documents, they typically just end up running another script. Whether it be a JavaScript file, Windows script file, or HTA, which is a HTML application. So, also kind of going back to If you remember the email filtering rules, those were the most popular attachments. Well, those are also the most popular scripts that the malicious office docs are running. So a couple options. One, you can disable Windows scripting host, which will prevent these files from executing. Because one great feature about Windows is if you have a JavaScript file and you just double click on it, it'll execute. So this would take care of that. The other option that I'm kind of keen on is actually changing this the default file association. So the idea is if you change JavaScript, WSH, and HTA to be associated with Notepad, when the user double clicks on them, it would just open in Notepad as opposed to actually running the bad stuff. Here's where you can do that in group policy pretty easily. It's under user configuration and folder options. You can see here that we basically just define the extension and then associate it with Notepad. Then when the end user opens it, this is what they get. So this is cool for two reasons. One, obviously we've stopped the attack. But two, I've observed that if an end user opens something, an attachment, all of a sudden this gobbledygook pops up, it kind of scares them and then kind of often motivates them to then report it to you. So it gives them another opportunity to do that. The other thing, so after it runs the script, it'll often run a binary depending on the attack. So I don't readily know a good way to block the binary download itself, excluding looking at things where you're doing SSL decryption and then doing network-based scanning that way. But because not every network solution has that available, we'll skip past that. So what we're going to, one thing you can do from detection, if you have anything that's doing process level monitoring or sysmon deployed, is you can actually look for Office documents that are downloading executable files to disk. So even if we can't prevent that, we at least have a detection mechanism in place. So from what we've done now, we've prevented JavaScript files and HTA files from running. We haven't prevented the download of the binary, but we can look at ways to maybe prevent its execution. So I'm just, for this, assuming antivirus is out of the equation, not because you don't have it installed, but because I would assume antivirus is not going to catch a lot of common threats as they come out. So there's two ways we can look at preventing the execution. One is going to be software restriction policies within group policy. The other one would be Windows firewall rules to actually firewall native binaries on the system. So software restriction policies are pretty cool. So if you can't do full application whitelisting, you can actually basically strategically deploy locations within the operating system that are going to be blacklisted from running executables. So it's under group policy, it's under the security settings. And two locations that are key to look at are going to be the temp directory within app data, as well as the C Windows temp. And the reasons these are often targeted by the attackers is they don't know the context that they're going to land on your system. They don't know the configuration of your system. So no matter what level of access the end user has that clicks on the file or runs the bad stuff, they're almost always going to have write access to a temp directory. So that's why they often target it. So creating the rules is super simple. It's just a matter of defining the path, as well as you can do a wildcard extension of what you're going to block. And then I guess one thing I would look out for, especially in the app data temp, is that a lot of third-party programs, whenever they go to do an auto update, it will drop the update file in there. So you either have to be prepared to handle those or whitelist those specifically. So kind of again with any other change, test it as much as possible. On this same note, another cool program to check out is called Crypto Prevent. I think the company that makes it's called Foolish IT. Oh, we had a good run. Yeah, so there's another third-party program called CryptoPrevent. It actually does a lot of cool things. Actually uses local group policy on the back end. But I've never deployed it from like a network perspective, but for like on your own like personal computer, it's really cool because it'll actually define software restriction policies for a lot of the top locations that malware deploys. I think with just the default settings, it adds like 3,000 to 5,000 software restriction policies, and in my experience, has had minimal negative impact. Another thing we can look at doing is the firewalling that I mentioned. So, and this is kind of based on the command line activity that a lot of the attacker groups are using whenever they're going to actually execute their malware. So there's, as an example, there's 2 recent campaigns that employed Casey Smith's one of his application whitelisting bypass techniques, and from a couple different actors as well. APT32 and APT19. The idea in his application whitelisting bypass techniques, which he has several, is he's going to use a binary that's native to the Windows operating system and get that to then execute the malicious binary. So even if you're doing full application whitelisting, his techniques actually would still execute. So that's pretty cool. So on this specific technique that they used, here's an example of it from Carbon Black whenever they did a study on it. So they would use Redshift32, which is a native and signed Windows binary, and they can actually pass it an HTTP address that would actually download the XML file, which would run whatever code is in it. So in this silly example, it's actually just going to run calc.exe. But this is a very common way used by some of the more advanced groups when they want malware to run in your system, partly because they're getting assigned Microsoft binary to execute their code, also because it bypasses application whitelisting. So one easy thing we can do to help prevent a lot of these is within group policy, you can set a Windows firewall rule that would actually say Redshift32 isn't allowed to make network connections. And there's actually several other binaries that he has found which have the same functionality, so I would recommend going through it and doing it on as much of these as possible. There's his blog right there if you want to read more about some of the attacks. But that's kind of an easy low-hanging fruit that would have prevented some of those attacks. All right, so at this point, we've taken care of the pre-email, the actual phishing email spam itself, and then the execution of the malware. So a couple things we can do on the command and control side. There are 3 types of links that one will encounter, or a combination. There's a link designed to harvest user credentials or other information. There's links designed to prompt the user to download a file, such as a Word document. As well as there's links with exploit kits to exploit the browser plugin. For that, it's more on the anti-exploit side. But when we think about controlling user access to the link, as well as the command and control itself, we can look at web filtering. So what I've done here is basically, if you think about the life cycle of a bad actor domain, they first will register it. Oftentimes they'll register it up to 6 months before they actively use it. At some point, once they start using it, it may get flagged as bad, or they also use dynamic domains. So what you can do is translate that into web filtering categories to look at and ensure you're blocking within your web filter. I think that everyone obviously blocks malware and phishing. But 2 that oftentimes people overlook are going to be on the park side, as well as the unknown and uncategorized. The only downside with the uncategorized is obviously a lot of legit websites may fall into that if the vendor just has not categorized it yet. So you have to have a process in place prepared for when users find that and report it to you. You need to be able to get it whitelisted so they don't have a mutiny. So consider integrating your firewalls with publicly available bad IP lists. So there's a couple good ones out there. Emerging Threats has a really good one that actually aggregates a lot of great information into one IP feed. And it's super easy with a lot of firewalls to actually integrate that list directly into the firewall, so it's blocking it proactively. You could also consider a process change for incident response. So what I've seen oftentimes is that certain actors will continue using the same hosting providers over and over. So a lot of times if you get a scan or see a bad IP and it's at say a certain VPS provider, one thing you can do is see what that VPS provider is, see what all their other subnets is, and then actually block the entire VPS provider if it's not one that's required for legitimate business use. Alright, so on the Office macro kill chain itself, so now we've blocked the macros, we've blocked the a lot of the exploits, we've blocked some of the execution of the binaries. We've also controlled JavaScript and HTA by changing the default file association and or disabling Windows scripting hosts, as well as we've greatly mitigated the chance that there's command and control will be able to call out to bad guy servers. So recently, there's been a big PDF uptick using email campaigns. And it's interesting because a lot of times the PDF will contain just a link to a website or embedded files or links to other files. Haven't seen a lot of PDF exploits this year. Not to say there hasn't been, but it's almost like just a way to deliver other known techniques. So, for example, there's been several PDF documents this year that just had a malicious Word document embedded. And what's funny about that is if you go back to the kill chain, it basically just makes it look like this. So the user would open the PDF, then open the embedded Word document, which would then do all the stuff that we've already mitigated. So this is a great example of if we had deployed all the mitigations at each of the kill chain links, as soon as the new tactic came out, we had already blocked it and didn't have anything to worry about. Alright, so so a recap of everything we've deployed to this point. So obviously we've reduced all of our overall phishing and mouse spam that we've received. We've made it a lot easier so that once those do get through, that the end user can report it to us. It's more actionable because we have the header data within it. We've also blocked a lot of the common malicious attachments that are used to target the enterprise. And if a user still receives the attachment, whether it be a Word document with a macro, we've enabled protected view. We've also blocked macros from running. If they're still able to run, the subsequent scripting should be blocked. And if it's able to download a binary, we've controlled some of the ways that they use to execute the binaries. And then lastly, we've made some network control changes to help reduce the possibility of a successful C2 connection. So, last big benefit that I want to throw out for looking at doing this with group policy is that what a lot of companies will observe is if you're not controlling end-user access to personal email, such as Yahoo, AOL, then a lot of times they will focus all their protections on the email filter without realizing that a user could actually receive one of these malicious emails to their personal email, open it up, and still get popped. So if we look at the group policy route and actually apply these policies to the endpoints, then even if they get a malicious email from their personal email, we've still blocked it from happening. It was pretty cool. All right. Any questions?
The VPS blocking the black hole stuff, do you have a process you guys are going through? Because you're obviously not going to block this Amazon, for example, but maybe a sketchy small provider, I understand.
Yeah, so I would definitely advise against blocking something like AWS, but I would say it's almost like a case-by-case basis depending on what the provider is. For example, if you find some VPS provider based out of the Ukraine that well, I guess one thing I would stress too is once you've identified all the subnets that belong to that provider, you should definitely check your networking logs and do a business impact analysis to see if anyone is legitimately accessing it. And that could be a breadcrumb as well that leads you into, okay, someone's accessing this site, but this site looks dodgy. You could find some other things from there as well. So it's kind of case by case basis, but you definitely want to do the impact analysis for deploying it or be prepared for the flip side, because what can happen too is you block an entire VPS provider of tens of thousands of IP ranges, and a user needs to be able to access one of those IPs. So you need to be able to whitelist that one specific one without allowing them all.
Talk a little about how Microsoft Windows can tell whether a file is coming from the internet or how you can apply macro blocking and stuff like that on it.
Yeah, so basically it's kind of based on the zones concept that you can actually kind of tweak a little bit within Internet Explorer, but it actually applies regardless of whether you downloaded it from that browser or not. So when it's basically generated from outside of the corporate network, it'll create an alternative data stream on the file itself that a normal end user won't be able to find. But if you know how to look at alternative data streams, you could take a look at it. And I think it, if I recall correctly, it'll tag it with a number, I think 1, 2, or 3. I can't remember which one correlates to the internet zone. And that's also kind of what leads, I don't know if you've ever downloaded an executable file from the internet and you actually had to go and right-click, go to properties, and unblock it before you're allowed to execute it. It's actually that same thing that's causing that to happen. And then I have links. I'm going to post my presentation on my site, but I have several reference links on Microsoft's site too that go into detail about how they're doing that and what all it's doing. Root-is-the-limit.com. With these specific ones, no. I mean, again, every company is different, and you may, especially when you get to dealing with a lot of very niche third-party software, they may be doing something funky. So there's definitely, you want to ensure to test it as much as possible. But for all the ones here, it should be minimal impact. But I can't say for certain it wouldn't be any. But that's kind of what I typically focus on, are ways to mitigate the threat with minimal impact to the user as much as possible. Cool. Any other questions? Yeah.
So in addition to the ransomware one that you mentioned, when it's file servers, you can use file screen to automatically block ransomware file extensions and actually allow it to, like, if it detects it, you can have it run a PowerShell script that'll shut down the remote host that's trying to write the files to it, so you can contain the images.
Yeah. That's a good point as well. Yeah.
Have you found that redirecting a specific file to notepad.exe instead of executing the actual file just trains the user to then right-click run or find another way to just get files to execute, or have they kind of learned through the double-click process that it opens up the code instead of actually running the executable?
I haven't seen them do that, but I guess to be fair, if they did that and then infected themselves, and as opposed to reporting it, it's kind of like you may not, I guess, know. But I haven't observed that. I don't know how many users would be able to figure that out. Especially if you disable a Windows scripting host, but it's possible. But I haven't specifically observed that. Yeah.
For your mobile users, let's say they get attachment mistakes on the mobile website, for phishing. Are you guys doing anything to kind of prevent them from being able to get to those sites? Because if you're on your network and render a block, filter to block the sites, that's all well. But once they're off your network, say at home, I guess anything to protect your system?
Sure, there's a couple things you can do for that. There are several endpoint security products that actually bake some type of web filtering within the agent that you can configure and deploy rules out straight to the endpoint agent. You can also, depending on your VPN setup, force it so that anytime users are outside your network, it forces them to connect to your VPN, which would then route through your firewall. There's also, I think there's group policy ways to deploy out blocks via, through the browser. I haven't tested that myself, but I've seen a couple of researchers talking about it recently. But those would probably be some of your better ways to help control that. Yeah. Cool. Anything else?
Do you play Overwatch?
Well, of course. I'm a filthy Mercy main.
Order Alliance.
I'm not going to touch that one. Also play a lot of Destiny if anyone is a fellow Destiny player. Yeah. Oh. Warlock. Yeah. Yeah. Cool.
Samples of games.